I just know that was a bad angle to pause him at. But so he was talking about the updated speeds that they was able to get with the PlayStation 5 SSD. All right, so basically what he is saying is whenever you load in a game, it has to get data from the SSD. That should save data, everything. But most importantly, the world itself. So they've gotten it down to where with this new technology that's in the PlayStation 5, and soon to be all over the world, right? But the technology that's in the PlayStation 5 is going to be able to grab that data fast, so fast, so where you as a developer, you don't have to worry about putting in extremely long load screens. In other words, there was games that, okay, so say this is what it looks like without a load screen. Okay, so you have a world that loads in, right? You'll have textures or um, normal maps that will pop in on the characters, meaning that you'll literally see the bump maps and the normals like load in on the character. You see the character's face load in. You'll see grass and trees and different props. So you're playing a game that's in some kind of dystopian type area, right? You'll see the cars pop in, the background pop in, the buildings pop in, the sun like code itself and light up the area. You will see all that like pop in. Like it's like literally drawing each little pixel in where it's supposed to be at. Well, loading screens hide that. So I never played Spider-Man, but I've seen the loading screen. So in Spider-Man, before you could play in those huge worlds, they would give you a subway car scene where Spider-Man was sitting next to somebody or listening to music or something. That's actually a streamed in loading screen or streamed in level so that the other level can load up be after that. So no, before that. So as soon as you say I want to go to level two, it'll start loading in level two, go to a dark screen, show you a loading screen that's already preloaded, right? It's already ready to go. So I don't have to make that. But it'll be steady putting this level behind it together. Well, the SSD cures that to where it doesn't cure it, but it makes it really, really quick. So now in Spider-Man or other games, like when you say I want to go to level two, it just gets it, loads it up, and there you go. uh, all right.
Not the primary reason to change from a hard drive to an SSD. The primary reason for an ultra-fast SSD is that it gives the game designer freedom. Or to put that differently, with a hard drive, the 20 seconds that it takes to load a gigabyte can sabotage the game that the developer is trying to create. I think almost all of us in the room have experienced this, maybe in different ways.
There you go. It's
Say
good
we're making
explainer.
an adventure game and we have two rich environments where we each want enough textures and models to fill memory. Which you can do as long as you have a long staircase or elevator ride or a windy corridor where you can ditch the old assets and then take 30 seconds or so to load the new assets. Having a 30-second elevator ride is a little extreme. More realistically, we'd probably chop the
30
world
seconds.
into a number of smaller pieces and then do some calculations with sight lines and run speeds like we did for Haven City when we were making Jack 2. The game is 20 years old, but not much has changed since then. All those twisty passages are there for a reason. There's a whole subset of level design dedicated to this sort of work, but still, it's a giant distraction for a team that just wants to make their game. So when I talked about the dream of an SSD, part of the reason for that 5 gigabyte a second target was to eliminate loads, but also part of the reason for that target was streaming. As in, what if the SSD is so fast that as the player is turning around, it's possible to load textures for everything behind the player in that split second? If you figure that it takes half a second to turn, that's 4 gigabytes of compressed data you can load. That sounds about right for next gen. Anyway, back to the hard drive. Another strategy for increasing effective read speed is to make big sequential chunks of data. For example, we might group all the data together for each city block. That removes most of the seeks, and the streaming gets faster. But there's a downside too, which is that frequently used data is included in many chunks and therefore is on the hard drive many, many times.
Okay, so right quick when he was talking about he showed like the vision cone and the character going back and forth. See, so Zero Horizon Dawn, they had a excuse me, a technology. Promise is not Corona. They had a technology like that already, where on the PlayStation 4, now mind you, where whatever Aloy was looking at, there was a certain specific area that she would look, but everything behind her wasn't programmed in. So like that's why in certain areas, if I'm remembering correctly, if I'm relating the story correctly, um, if you would look at something like a plant, you look at it right here and then you turn and come back, the plant will be in a different area because everything has been preloaded in, not preloaded. Everything has been loaded in as you're looking at it. Because that game was really heavy. It ran at 30 frames per second too, but it was doing a lot for its time. So what he's talking about now though, so even like with Zero Horizon Dawn, that game can run at 60 now because with the SSD, it's able to load all this stuff in that they're already cutting out to increase performance. It's able to load that back in really quick. So in essence, it might not be no reason to do that. I'm not. I'm just saying with that game. I'm just wondering with that game if they was a cut out, like if they had everything just right there. I'm just kind of curious. But anyway, that's the thing that he was saying, creative freedom. Because now when you're used to cutting corners for performance, right? Because of speed, because of this, and then you got the double speed. So if you're able to still kind of trick and manipulate it to be quicker on base consoles before this SSD, then you're able to do it now. That means that your game is going to run even faster. But then too, sometimes you would design based around your load times. And with the PlayStation 5, some of these games is actually cutting that out.
Marvel's Spider-Man uses this strategy, and though it works very well for increasing the streaming speed, there's a massive duplication as a result. Some of the objects like mailboxes or news racks are on the hard drive 400 times. What I'm describing here are things that cramp a creative director's style. Either level design gets a little bit boring in places, or the data is duplicated so many times that it no longer fits on the Blu-ray disc. And you end up with hard limits on the player's run speed or driving speed. The player can't go faster than the load speed from the hard drive. And finally, I'm sure many of you have noticed that after a patch download, a PlayStation 4 will sometimes take a long time to install the patch. That's because when just part of a file has been changed, the new data can be downloaded pretty quickly. But before the game boots up, a brand new file has to be constructed that includes the changed portion. Otherwise, every change would add a seek or two. Even so, you can occasionally see this happening on game titles. They start to hitch once they get patched enough. With an SSD, though, no seeks, so no need to make brand new files with the changes incorporated into them, which means no installs as you know them today. There's yet one more benefit, which is that system memory can be used much more efficiently. On PlayStation 4, game data on the hard drive feels very distant and difficult to use. By the time you realize you need a piece of data, it's much too late to go out and load it. So system memory has to contain all of the data that could be used in the next 30 seconds or so of gameplay. That means a lot of the 8 gigabytes of system memory is idle. It's just waiting there to be potentially used. On PlayStation 5, though, the SSD is very close to being like more RAM. Typically, it's fast enough that when you realize you need a piece of data, you can just load it from the SSD and use it. There's no need to have lots of data parked in system memory waiting to potentially be used. A different way of saying that is that most of RAM is working on the game's behalf. This is one of the reasons that 16 gigabytes of GDDR6 feels right for PlayStation 5. The presence of the SSD reduces the need for a massive intergenerational increase in size. So back to the dream of the SSD. Here's the set of targets. Boot the game in a second. No load screens. Design freedom, meaning no twisty passages or long corridors. More game on the disk and more game on the SSD. And finally, those patch installs go away. The reality, though, is that the SSD is just one piece of the puzzle. There's a lot of places where bottlenecks can occur in between the SSD and the game code that uses the data. You can see this on PlayStation 4. If I use an SSD with 10 times the speed of a standard hard drive, I probably see only double the loading speed, if that. For PlayStation 5, our goal was not just that the SSD itself be 100 times faster. It was that game loads and streaming would be 100 times faster. So every single potential bottleneck needed to be addressed.
Okay, so I need myself to really break those down and understand all those as far as regarding SSD. But what he was saying as far as like putting, okay, so in the PlayStation 4, it came standard with a hard drive, but you could take the hard drive out and put an SSD in there. When you put an SSD in there, there's a okay, Digital Foundry did a video on it. I can't remember what games that they put in, but I know Spider-Man was one of them. So when you took out the hard drive and put in the SSD, the record speed of the game loading and different things popping in, like things loading in as you're playing, would be faster. But what he is saying here is that they just didn't want to just pop in an SSD into it. They want to get a custom SSD, tap into the potential of that SSD, and make sure that every part of it is used. Hence, that's why the GDR5 versus the DDR6, DDR, Dance Revolution. um, they wanted to make sure that every bit of that was used, which means that they have to go in and literally compute, customize, code both of those components together so that everything meshes together for better use and development.
And there are a lot of them. Let's look at check-in and what happens when its overhead gets 100 times larger. Conceptually, check-in is a pretty simple process. Data is loaded into system memory from the hard drive or SSD. It's examined, a few values are tweaked to check it in, and then it's moved to its final location. At the SSD speeds we're talking about, that last part, moving the data, meaning copying it from one location to another, takes roughly an entire next-gen CPU core. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. If all the overheads get 100 times larger, that will cripple the frame rate as soon as the player moves and that massive stream of data starts coming off the SSD. So to solve all of that, we built a lot of custom hardware, namely a custom flash controller and a number of custom units in our main chip. The flash controller in the SSD was designed for smooth and bottleneck-free operation, but also with games in mind. For example, there are 6 levels of priority when reading from the SSD. Priority is very important. You can imagine the player heading into some new location in the world and the game requesting a few gigabytes of textures. And while those textures are being loaded, an enemy is shot and has to speak a few dying words. Having multiple priority levels lets the audio for those dying words get loaded immediately. On one side, that flash controller connects to the actual flash dies that supply the storage. To reach our bandwidth target of 5 gigabytes a second, we ended up with a 12-channel interface. 8 channels wouldn't be enough. The resulting bandwidth we've achieved is actually 5.5 gigabytes a second. With a 12-channel interface, the most natural size that emerges for an SSD is 825 gigabytes. The key question for us was, is that enough? I mean, it's tempting to add more, but Flash certainly doesn't come cheap, and we have a responsibility to our gaming audience to be cost-effective with regards to what we put in the console.
That is for sure.
Ultimately, we resolved this question by looking at the play patterns of a broad range of gamers. We examined the specific games that they were playing over the course of a weekend or a week or a month, and whether that set of games would fit properly on the SSD. We were able to establish that the friction caused by reinstalls or redownloads would be quite low, and so we locked in on that 825 gigabyte size, while also preparing multiple strategies so that those who want more storage can add it. I'll go through the details in a moment. Back to the flash controller. On the other side, it connects to our main custom chip via 4 lanes of Gen 4 PCIe. And inside the main custom chip is a pretty hefty unit dedicated to I/O. Before we talk about what that does, let's talk compression for a moment. PlayStation 4 used zlib as its compression format. We decided to use it again on PlayStation 5, but on my 2017 tour of developers, I learned about a new format called Kraken from Rad Game Tools. It's like zlib's smarter cousin. Simple, similar types of algorithms, but about 10% better compression, which is pretty big. That means 10% more game on the UHD Blu-ray disc or on the SSD.
Okay, hold up. So I'm gonna take some personal notes on that one because I am going to PCI ports. I was going to look up actually next, but that Kraken and VLib, going to remember those. And see, this is what I'm talking about as far as deeper learning, understanding this stuff.
Kraken had only been out for a year, but it was already becoming a de facto industry standard. Half of the teams I talked to were either using it or getting ready to evaluate it. So we hustled and built a custom decompressor into the I/O unit, one capable of handling over 5 gigabytes of Kraken format input data a second. After decompression, that typically becomes 8 or 9 gigabytes, but the unit itself is capable of outputting as much as 22 gigabytes a second if the data happen to compress particularly well. By the way, in terms of performance, that custom decompressor equates to 9 of our Zen 2 cores. That's what it would take to decompress the Kraken stream with a conventional CPU. There's a lot more in the custom I/O unit, including a dedicated DMA controller. The game can direct exactly where it wants to send the data coming off of the SSD. This equates to another Zen 2 core or two in terms of its copy performance. Its primary purpose is to remove check-in as a bottleneck. There's 2 dedicated I/O coprocessors and a large RAM pool. These aren't Zen 2 cores. They're there principally to direct the variety of custom hardware around them. One of the coprocessors is dedicated to SSD I/O. This lets us bypass traditional file I/O and its bottlenecks when reading from the SSD. The other is responsible for memory mapping, which I know doesn't sound like anything related to the SSD, but a lot of developers map and remap memory as part of file I/O, and this too can become a bottleneck. There are coherency engines to assist the coprocessors. Coherency comes up a lot in places. Probably the biggest coherency issue is stale data in the GPU caches. Flushing all of the GPU caches whenever the SSD is read is an unattractive option. It could really hurt the GPU performance. So we've implemented a gentler way of doing things, where the coherency engines inform the GPU of the overwritten address ranges, and custom scrubbers in several dozen GPU caches do pinpoint evictions of just those address ranges. The best thing is, as a game developer, when you read from the SSD, you don't need to know any of this. You don't even need to know that your data is compressed. You just indicate what data you'd like to read from your original uncompressed file and where you'd like to put it, and the whole process of loading it happens invisibly to you and at very high speed. Back to the...
Okay, so before I end the video, it's 17 minutes in. All right, to kind of sum that up, but again, need to go back through that and break each one of those down to understand what that is. But to sum that up, so Kraken is a when you compress data, you taking something that's bigger and compressing it down. Hence, a compressed file that you might get from somebody, you can uncompress it and then get all the data. But essentially, you're taking a big piece of memory and smalling it down to a small piece of memory, but still contain the same amount of data. So, but this is able to, so the PlayStation 5 uses Kraken, which is able to decompress more data at a different rate, and the PlayStation is able to decompress that quicker. I mean, quickly, basically, in sort of a nutshell. But yeah, definitely look Kraken up, and VLab he called it. But yeah, definitely look Kraken up. But anyway, I'm gonna stop the video right here and kick it back off. This is video